Most people do not fail because compound interest is fake. They fail because they worship it too early. That is the first thing I want burned into your mind. Compound interest is real. It is powerful. It is one of the greatest forces in money. But it is not a rescue helicopter that arrives the moment you open a brokerage account. It is not a miracle that turns tiny contributions into a life of freedom on a timeline your emotions can tolerate. And that is where millions of people get hurt. They are shown the chart, the smooth upward curve, the beautiful future value line, the magical sentence about starting small and staying consistent. Then they look at their own account. The number barely moves. 1 year passes, then 3, then 5, and the result feels insulting. That is when the poison enters. Maybe this whole thing is overhyped. Maybe index funds are too slow. Maybe I need higher returns. Maybe I need crypto. Maybe I need options. Maybe to swing harder. Most of the time, the problem is simpler and more brutal than that. The problem is size. The problem is that compounding has a threshold. Below that threshold, it is technically working and emotionally invisible. And emotionally invisible is where people quit. That is what this entire story is really about, not whether compounding works. When it starts to matter enough to feel like your life is actually changing, the source document opens with that exact tension. People are shown charts where tiny monthly investments turn into large balances over decades. But when they run the same math on their own accounts, the lived result feels nothing like the promise. The source makes the key point plainly: compound interest works. But below a certain contribution threshold, it does almost nothing you can emotionally notice for the first 10 to 15 years. That is the central wound in the whole discussion. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 57 File 0 Fay-Good. Because that is the adult way to frame the problem. Not as a morality play, not as a motivational poster, as a phase problem. And if you do not understand the phase, you will misdiagnose the pain. You will think the answer is more risk when the real answer was more contribution. You will think the answer is more intelligence when the real answer was more input. You will think the answer is a hotter asset when the real answer was a larger pile. That mistake is one of the most expensive mistakes in all of personal finance. So let me give you the master metaphor for this whole story. I call it the silent flywheel. Imagine a giant iron flywheel in a factory. At the beginning, you push it with everything you have and it barely moves. You push again, still barely moves. You come back the next day, you push. The thing still feels disrespectful, heavy, unimpressed, slow. Now imagine somebody walks in at year 10 and sees it already turning fast. He says, "Look at that, what a beautiful machine." He did not see the first years. He did not see the humiliation. He did not see the phase where all the energy came from you and almost none from the machine itself. That is compounding in real life. In the early years, you are the engine. Later, the machine joins you. Much later, if you stayed long enough and fed it enough, the machine starts doing more work than you do. That is the dream. But the dream is phase 2. The pain is phase 1, and the source is right that almost nobody explains the difference cleanly enough. It says compounding has 2 phases. Phase 1 is the contribution phase, where your own monthly inputs do almost all the work. Phase 2 is the compounding phase, where returns begin to outpace your contributions, and the math starts feeling almost effortless. That is the whole map in 2 sentences. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 57, File 0 Fay. Exactly. That is the map. And if you had handed that map to me when I was younger, it would have saved me from a lot of confusion. Because once you see the map, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, why is compound interest not saving me yet? You start asking, how fast can I get the flywheel heavy enough that it begins helping me in a way I can actually feel? That is a much better question. And it leads to very different behavior. The first mechanism in this story is what I call the invisibility tax. The source gives the cleanest possible example. Put $50 into an index fund earning 8% a year. After 12 months you made about $4. Technically, the money compounded. Practically nothing happened that feels meaningful to a human being trying to build a life. The source then extends this same logic out over time at $50 a month. After 5 years, the balance is around $3,600. After 10 years, around $9,200. After 20 years, around $29,500. After 30 years, around $74,500. That is real money. Yes, but after 3 full decades, it still does not look like the kind of freedom the original charts made people imagine. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 57, File 0 Fay. That is why I call it the invisibility tax. Not because the returns are fake, because the life impact is delayed so long that most humans will emotionally discount it. This is one of the deepest truths in personal finance. A lot of mathematically correct advice is still behaviorally weak. Just start small and stay consistent is mathematically true. Fine, but the human mind is not a spreadsheet. Humans need reinforcement. They need evidence. They need to feel that effort is turning into something. And when the output stays invisible for too long, discipline begins to rot. That is not a character defect. That is a design failure in how the story gets told. The source says this directly, and it matters enormously. If you are below the threshold where compounding becomes noticeable, the early years feel pointless. And humans are not built to keep doing something that feels pointless for a decade straight. That is the real danger. Not that compounding fails, that people quit before it becomes visible. Phaephilosite Phaeturn 57 file 0 Phay. That is the first injury. The charts create a fantasy speed reality, delivers a much slower emotional experience. The gap between those two becomes discouragement. And discouragement is where bad financial decisions breed. The second mechanism is what I call the input dominance phase. This is where the source becomes especially useful because it stops speaking in slogans and starts speaking in numbers. It compares monthly contributions of $50, $200, and $400 using the same 8% return and the same time horizon. At $50 a month over 30 years, the result is roughly $74,500. At $200 a month, nearly $298,000 at $400 a month. Close to $595,000. The rate stayed the same. The time stayed the same. The only variable that changed was the amount being fed into the machine every month. Phaephilosite Phaeturn 57 file 0. Phay, that is an incredibly important observation because it destroys one of the most seductive lies in all of beginner investing. The lie says returns are everything. Number at the beginning. Returns are not everything. Input is everything. Input dominates. That is what the source is trying to hammer into people. And it is exactly right. When your balance is small, the return percentage is a weak force acting on a weak base. The base matters more. A bigger base makes the same percentage suddenly matter. This is why wealthy people seem to get richer without effort. The source gives the comparison cleanly. Somebody with $500,000 earning 7% makes $35,000 a year from returns alone. Somebody with $5,000 earning 7% makes $350. Same principle, completely different life effect. The difference is not magic, it is size. Phaephilosite Phaeturn 57 file 0 Phay, exactly. And once you understand that, something very important shifts in your behavior. You stop asking, how do I find the perfect return? You start asking, how do I increase the pile? That is the better question. And the better question always leads you back toward contribution growth. Not because returns do not matter, because they matter later. That is what input dominance means. In phase 1, you are not primarily a capital allocator. You are a pile builder, a base constructor, a contribution machine. That is the whole job. And because so few people say that clearly, millions of beginners waste years chasing the wrong variable. The third mechanism is what I call rate worship. This is where many intelligent people get themselves hurt. The source says the trap looks like this. Returns feel too small, so the investor assumes the answer is to chase a higher return. He wants 15% instead of 8%. He wanders into riskier assets, speculative stocks, crypto options, and high volatility bets because he thinks the return line is the problem. Then the source runs the math. At $200 a month over 10 years, 8% produces around $36,800. At 16%, around $52,200. That's better, yes. But the gain is about $15,000, more over a decade, and it requires a dramatically more dangerous path. Then the source shows something far more important. Instead of doubling the return, simply increasing the contribution from $200 to $350 at 8% gets you around $64,000. More money, less risk, same time window. Phaephilosite Phaeturn 57 file 0 Phay. That is one of the sharpest lessons in the entire file. And it should humble a great many people, because it reveals that a lot of what gets called aggressive investing at small balances is really just impatience wearing a finance costume. The investor feels the emotional pain of slow progress. He thinks the medicine is higher returns. Often the medicine is bigger contributions. This is why I call it rate worship. People start treating the return percentage as though it were the main god of wealth. Building it is not. In phase 1, rate matters much less than most people think. What matters is how much fuel you are loading into the machine. This is also why I think a lot of beginner investing content is quietly destructive. It flatters the fantasy that clever asset selection can compensate for low input. Sometimes, in rare cases, yes, usually not. Usually the beginner would be much better served by becoming better at earning, budgeting, redirecting, automating, and increasing the monthly contribution rate than by spending hours trying to find a higher expected return. That is not boring advice. That is serious advice, because a large contribution at a sensible rate beats a tiny contribution at a heroic rate far more often than people want to admit. The fourth mechanism is what I call the threshold. This is the number everybody wants. The source says the feeling shift. The point where compounding stops being abstract and starts doing work, you can actually notice, tends to arrive somewhere around $100,000 to $150,000 in total invested assets. At $100,000 earning 8%, the portfolio is generating around $8,000 a year, or about $667 a month, without any new contribution. That is when the snowball stops feeling like metaphor and starts feeling like equipment. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 57, File 0 Phay. That is why I care so much about the first $100,000. Not because the number is sacred, because the labor relationship changes there before the threshold. You are dragging the cart after the threshold. The cart begins helping. The threshold is where the account stops being a container and begins becoming an employee. That is the real emotional transition. And it is a profound one. The source then runs examples that make this brutally concrete at $100 a month. After 10 years, you might have only about $18,400, nowhere near the threshold. At $500 a month after 10 years, you might reach around $91,500, close enough to see the threshold approaching. At $1,000 a month after 10 years, you might be around $184,000, well above it. That is not just a bigger number. That is a different phase of financial life. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 57, File 0 Phay. Exactly. And this is where people's ambitions need to become more serious. The early goal is not retire rich. The early goal is cross the threshold. That is the mission. Cross the line where the machine starts becoming visibly useful. Once that happens, confidence changes, patience changes, discipline changes, options change, because a person who can see the machine working is much more willing to keep feeding it than a person who feels as though every contribution disappears into a black hole. This is why I think the threshold idea is worth a fortune by itself. It gives the first decade a real target, not vague hope a target. And targets change behavior. The fifth mechanism is what I call the split. This is one of the cleanest mathematical sections in the whole source, and it may be the most psychologically useful. The source describes a contribution versus return split. In the beginning, if your account grows by $240 in a month and $200 of that came from you, while only $40 came from returns, then you did 83% of the work and the market did 17%. Later, that's $50,000. 8% annual returns generate about $333 a month. If you are still contributing $200, the split becomes closer to 60/40. At $100,000, returns at 8% generate about $667 a month while you still contribute $200, meaning the account is now doing more than 3 times the work you are doing. At $200,000, the account can generate roughly $1,333 per month at 8%, 6 or 7 times your original monthly contribution. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 57, File 0 Phay. That is the split. And the split explains almost all the emotional confusion around compounding in the early years. You think the machine is weak because it is weak compared with you. You are doing most of the lifting. Later, you think the machine is miraculous because it becomes miraculous relative to your personal labor. That is not because the laws of mathematics suddenly changed. It is because the split changed. Once you understand the split, your expectations stop lying to you. You stop looking at year 2 results and wondering why you do not feel rich. You understand that year 2 is still mostly you. That is normal. And normal is a very comforting thing when you are fighting discouragement. The split also reveals one of the most important truths in all of money. The people you envy now probably lived through years where their account barely helped them at all. They just did not post those years. The source says this directly, and it is exactly right. Social media shows people the phase where the portfolio is throwing off meaningful returns, not the long, dull, frustrating years where nothing seemed to be happening. That missing decade warps expectations. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 57, File 0 Phay. Yes, and warped expectations are what break discipline. The sixth mechanism is what I call the contribution staircase. This is where the source turns practical and earns a great deal of respect from me. It says the real strategy is not compound interest as an abstract religion, The real strategy is contribution growth. Increase the monthly amount over time. Ask what it would take to increase your current contribution by $50 this month. Then ask again next month. Treat investing like a fixed bill, not like a leftover category. Move the money automatically on payday before the rest of life eats it. And when income rises, do not let lifestyle absorb all of it. Send part of each raise straight into the investment stream. Felicite Turn 57 File 0 Fe, that is excellent advice, because it transforms compounding from a waiting game into an offensive strategy. A lot of people speak as though wealth building is mainly patience. It is not mainly patience. In phase 1, it is aggression, not reckless aggression. Savings aggression, contribution aggression, lifestyle containment, income expansion, raise capture, expense redirection. That is the contribution staircase. You do not need one heroic jump. You need repeated upward pressure. And because the source recommends only asking for a small increase first, $50 more, it respects psychology too. Small increases repeated over time become massive. It gives the example that $50 more per month over 20 years at 8% becomes roughly $29,400 from one incremental decision. Felicite Turn 57 File 0 Fe, that is exactly how a real wealthy life is built. Not from one act of genius, from repeated redirection, a little more each month. Then again, until the machine crosses the threshold and begins helping. That is why I like the staircase image, because people imagine wealth as a leap. Often, it is stairs. The seventh mechanism is what I call the identity inversion. This is the deepest lesson in the whole document and the one most people will miss if they only listen to the numbers. The source says, stop thinking of compound interest as the strategy. Compound interest is the reward. The strategy is contribution growth. Felicite Turn 57 File 0 Fe, that sentence changes everything because it flips the order of responsibility. You are not waiting for the market to save you. You are building a base. The market can finally amplify. That is a much more dignified way to think. It means your first decade is not a failure phase. It is a construction phase. It means the invisible years are not wasted. They are foundation years. It means your job is not to sit there hoping for the curve. Your job is to keep lifting your monthly contribution as far as your life reasonably allows until the curve becomes real. That is identity inversion. You stop identifying as someone waiting for compounding. You become someone manufacturing the conditions under which compounding can finally matter. And that is a much more powerful identity. Now let me bring all of this together into one operating system, because the point of a document like this is not to leave you inspired for 12 minutes. It is to change how you move. I call it the compounding threshold protocol. First, stop worshiping tiny contributions just because they are mathematically legal. Ask whether your current monthly amount is actually big enough to generate visible progress on a human timeline. Second, respect phase 1. In the early years, you are the engine. The market is helping, but you are still doing most of the work. Third, stop chasing rate before you have built size. Input dominates while balances are small. Fourth, make the first $100,000 to $150,000 the mission. That is where the machine starts becoming emotionally real. Fifth, track the split. How much of your monthly growth is you? And how much is the portfolio? Watching that relationship change is one of the best ways to stay sane. Sixth, grow the contribution staircase deliberately. Automatic increases, raise capture, expense redirection, extra work, all of it matters. Seventh, remember the real hierarchy: contribution growth first, compounding second. That is the protocol. And if you follow it, something very important happens. You stop being disappointed by phase 1. You stop asking it to feel like phase 2. That is emotional maturity. And emotional maturity may be the most underrated investing skill in the world. Now let me tell you the harshest truth in the whole conversation. A lot of people are going to spend years trying to solve a contribution problem with an investment problem. They are going to waste incredible emotional energy trying to find a smarter ETF, a hotter sector, a faster return, a magic strategy, all while the real answer was sitting there the whole time. More input, more directed fuel, more pile. That is not always easy. Sometimes it is brutally hard. Sometimes income is low, costs are high, and life is heavy. I do not want to romanticize that, but I do want to say the truth clearly. When balances are small, the path to visible wealth is rarely superior brilliance. It is superior contribution. The source ends with exactly the right psychological message. The early phase is supposed to feel slow. The invisible work is still work. The math is still building, even when you cannot emotionally feel it yet. And the right response is not to quit. It is to stay in the game long enough for the threshold to flip the relationship in your favor. Fey Felicite, Fey turn 57 file 0 Fey. Exactly. That is the right final lesson. Not trust the magic. Trust the phase. Know which phase you are in, know what the phase requires, and stop asking an unbuilt machine to behave like a finished one. So let me leave you with the cleanest version of the whole argument. Compound interest is not useless. It is delayed. And delay becomes dangerous when people are never taught what the early years are really for. The early years are not there to make you feel rich. They are there to help you cross the line where compounding stops whispering and starts speaking in a voice loud enough to change your life. That is the threshold, and the faster you reach it, the sooner the flywheel helps. That is why the amount you invest every month matters more than almost anything else at the beginning. Not forever at the beginning. That distinction matters, because once you cross the line, the story changes. The machine starts helping, the split flips. The returns start mattering in a way that finally feels worthy of the hype. That is phase 2. But phase 2 is not where discipline begins. It is where discipline gets paid. And if you understand that, you stop being angry at the early years. You stop comparing your month 3 to someone else's year 12. You stop chasing hotter returns because you feel unseen. You stop blaming compounding for not being miraculous before the threshold. You do the hard thing instead. You feed the machine until it wakes up. That is the real job. That is the real strategy. And that is why most people do not need a better chart. They need a bigger monthly contribution and a more honest timeline. Once they have that, the whole story changes. Not because the math changed, because they finally stopped asking the math to lie to them